Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm really glad to see everyone here um, for the start, kind of like getting things started on the EMPATHS-1 project. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to start out very briefly, just giving a little bit of a perspective from someone who studies empathy and why I am interested in this project. Um, and then GJ is going to present on the methodology and the project itself and what we're planning to do. And then we'll have time for questions after. All right, so um, yeah, so the way I became interested, I've been studying empathy for 15 years at the time or something like this. And I consider myself an expert in empathy. I mean, I have a PhD in that, um, and I'm not defining empathy here because we all kind of have a definition of empathy in our minds, even if we have never studied empathy, right? So every layperson has a kind of an understanding, and that's often the case in psychology, anyways. But it comes with a bit of a problem when we then want to study empathy. So here is what you see here is a project called Every Name Counts. It's a project that is done by a German nonprofit, and the aim is to have people engage in a project, come on board, do something in order to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust, and to then hopefully translate that activity into reduced bias, and also maybe civic action when it comes to the modern challenges that Germany is facing with the rising right and things like this. So it's an ambitious project, and I think it's pretty cool. And a friend of mine is more on the applied side of social psychology, and she works with organizations like this one and tries to help them evaluate their interventions and whether they work. So this project, we can click, is basically what it entails is that participants in this, and that's just the general public, it's advertised on social media and on in the internet online, and people come in and they see these prisoners' documents from the concentration camps of the Nazis. And they are contributing to digitizing these WIC records. And as they're doing it, that's the idea behind this, they also see the person in there, right? There's not that much information, just kind of demographics, but you learn a bit about their profession and things like this, and people start imagining the other person. And so this organization thinks that the mechanism behind this intervention and why it works is that people start empathizing with the victims of the Holocaust, and that then translates into these anticipated outcomes. So my friend was telling me about this, and I said, okay, that's really cool. But how do you know it's empathy? And she was like, well, you tell me it would be really good to assess this. So can you help me study this? So we can go to the next. And when we think about empathy, this organization already had some questionnaires once in a while. And part of it was, for example, a question like, how much empathy do you feel? And when we ask this question, we don't know what people really understand empathy to be. And empathy, when you study it from the scientific perspective, as some of you might know, you can go on. You can split it up into kind of like the feeling component and then the understanding component of empathy. So I'm feeling the same as you're feeling. I'm kind of like putting myself into your perspective, into your shoes, and I understand how you're feeling. There's also other components to it. Just go on to the next. Yeah, so some people think that there's a kind of other-oriented caring, kind of sympathy, I feel for you aspect to empathy. And then the next one, that maybe there's an action involved in this as well, that there's some sort of orientation as well. And one thing that research has, shown is that the self-other distinction is also really important. I think this might not actually be, yeah. And so there is kind of like the sharing aspect of empathy, but it's also become more and more clear that if we overshare, kind of like I feel your distress and I become really self-focused and I put myself into your shoes and I take that on, and there's kind of like a lack of self-other distinction, it might backfire. So there's some work showing this. So if you go one more of the animations, it can happen that when it comes to the feeling part of empathy, that leads to personal distress, and then we disengage and we tend not to help other people. So you could see in this study, it could backfire, right? Like you feel upset, you feel kind of like bad about these victims, so you disengage and don't participate anymore. Or when it comes to the cognitive part of empathy, it could lead to guilt. And that might be very harmful, especially in this context. Everyone knows about German guilt and how, and so to speak, that people are just sort of like disengaging, and that might actually backfire potentially. And so it's really important to measure empathy in all these different components, and there might be more, but we don't really know how. So my friend was like, oh, that's really interesting. I explained all that to her. And then she asked me, so what are the measures that I should be using? And I was just sitting there. I don't know. There are not very good measures that get at all these different components. There's actually kind of like not that much out there that measures state empathy in response to a particular individual. Most people are just making it up as they go. And that's all okay, but how can we even find the particular measures that we want? And so I felt really disempowered, actually, walking in and being like, oh, let me tell you as an expert in empathy how you should do it and how you understand this, and I can help you make this intervention better. And then I just couldn't even recommend good measures. So that's where I'm coming from. This project is all about kind of addressing these issues, and that's why I'm excited about it. So, basically, if we can understand empathy, if we can understand the constructs, the measures that go with the different aspects of how we understand empathy in a particular relevant context, because there might be different kinds of understandings of empathy that are relevant in each context, then we can really make our research have an impact in the world, like people learning actually from history.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Very clear. So I will actually try to make this briefer, also because I think Mira, Jasmine, and Ron kind of know this already a bit. And Jenny, you definitely also know this already a bit. But this is also for the people at home who are not present now. So this is kind of the starting point. If you want to actually do anything in the world, you need to have a pretty good idea of what you're talking about and how you want to intervene, for example. The reproducibility crisis suggested that perhaps we don't really know what we're talking about so well, because when we try to replicate studies, quite often we get quite different results. One of the causes that has been pointed to was the jingle-jangle fallacy, or the phenomenon that questionnaires that purportedly measure the same construct turn out to measure very different things if you look at the kind of items they have, and questionnaires for very different constructs are almost interchangeable and basically measure the same stuff. This is a very nice example from Eiko Fried from depression questionnaires. He looked at 7 depression questionnaires that were used a lot. The wheels in this circle are the measurement instruments and the spokes are the symptoms. And as you can see, there are actually, out of these 7 commonly used scales, no 2 that overlap completely. So they overlap a bit, fortunately, because they're talking about the same thing, but they also overlap distressingly little. So that means that whether you're classified as a depressed patient, either in a study or in clinical practice, because these are also used as aids in diagnosis, just depends on whichever questionnaire they happen to use. This, of course, is a bit problematic, because if we want to help people with depression, we first need to know what depression is, if we want to actually have therapies that align with this. In my field, behavior change land, as I call it, caringly, we have a big effort in the UK where they create a huge ontology meant to describe behavior change interventions, including, therefore, the constructs, the determinants of behavior that those interventions target. In this ontology you can search, so you have the search box and you can type in, for example, attitude, and then you find this with, as the definition, a mental disposition that is an affective attitude or an evaluative belief about something. That's a bit brief for something that we can't actually directly observe. That brevity is not special, not particular to attitude. We looked at the constructs that were in this ontology, and those were all behavior related, so predicting human behavior, over 1,000 constructs, and the mean number of words was 16. So all these definitions of constructs were super brief. That's not because they were lazy. They actually went through a lot of effort to make sure they have the proper construct definitions. They went back to the original authors, or if they had passed away, to close collaborators who used the theory a lot. And then in a number of iterations, 7 at most, as you see in this table, they improved the definitions until everybody was happy. So this is not indicative of them being sloppy. This is indicative of what we in psychology consider an adequate, proper definition for something that we cannot observe and that we have very little reason to believe is a natural kind. So this is a bit problematic. The problem, of course, is this is what we study. We study neurons. And there are a lot of those, like 90 billion. I counted them. That took like 2 days. And they're connected to, on average, 7,000 other neurons. I always thought like 1 or 2 or 3, because that's the pictures you see in the textbooks. And unlike Jennifer, I don't do this bio stuff, so I don't actually know the truth until I looked this up on Wikipedia, and then I found out that they are connected to 7,000 neurons on average. So that means we have about 630, lots of zeros, connections in our mind. They can fire, apparently, according to Wikipedia, about 200 times a second, which means about 720,000 times an hour, which means that if you store data and you only store whether neurons fire, so you don't store the action potential, but only whether they are excited, whether they go off or not, then you need about, 0.5, half a zettabyte for an hour for a person. And in 2023, we had enough storage capacity on our planet to store about 2 days of data for one person. Of course, writing the data to the hard disks also takes some time. So that means that this is basically not a feasible way to study humans. So what we do is we have constructs, which is just basically stuff we invent, like analogies, metaphors for stuff in the human psyche. The problem is that these are not natural kinds. Like water, for example, everything with 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom is water. And if you find a molecule with 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, you also know for sure that it is water. There are no exceptions to this. The boiling point of water is about 100 degrees Celsius. And it doesn't really matter which kind of thermometer you use or where on the planet you go. Some people might go to the North Pole. Some people might go on the mountain in Austria or something. Some people might go to the sea. So you have pressure differences and stuff. And people might have slightly different definitions of boiling. So some people might say you need to have at least 8 bubbles a minute. And other people might say whenever you have the first bubble or a certain amount of steam, it's boiling. But whatever you do, people will not come back and say it's minus 200 degrees or it's plus 2000 degrees. All their estimates will be roughly around 100 degrees Celsius because they are measuring the same thing, which is just there in the world, and it doesn't matter what we think about it. That's not the case for aspects of the human psyche, unfortunately. So that means that we have a bit more challenging job. So that's not the case that if we have a number of measurement instruments, scales, questionnaires, whatever, computer tasks, that purport to measure the same thing, that they measure the same thing. They most likely measure different things if they are different. Unless we have pretty strong evidence that they do measure the same thing, evidence other than correlational. Also, similarly, it's not the case that if we have different definitions in different studies, that they are about really the same thing. Actually, this picture is already quite optimistic. I expect that if you really start looking at this, as we will, that you'll actually find a bit less overlap than, well, say 80% or something that you see here. So we have a situation that we study stuff that you can't directly observe, where the definitions that we use and rely on are only about 15 or 16 words long, where therefore every researcher who wants to actually study something has to extend that definition, elaborate it in their minds, before they can create a measurement instrument or a manipulation or even hypothesize and think about theory. They have to do that with a comprehensive definition that has that cuts out a bit of the human psyche much more clearly than the 15 or 16 words. But of course people do this differently. And they don't talk about this because we use the 15 or 16 word definition. And then you get all these different measurement instruments and the different manipulations, etc. And that's actually a good thing. This is the most complicated bit. We actually want diversity. We want pluriformity. Because we know that this actually helps scientific progress. If we don't have this, we risk getting in a local optimum or minimum, maximum, minimum. Basically, we get stuck in an idea of how reality might look that's actually wrong, but we can't really get out because we don't vary anymore. So we do want people to have different definitions. We just want to know that they have different definitions and know which extensive definition they have, so that we can start looking at differences, compare those to findings, and then start having discussions about what might work when and what that means about the human psyche. So the idea here is that we draw conclusions based on the analyses we do on data, which we collect given a certain method, which we developed based on our theory and our philosophy of science. Basically our ontological stances, how we think the world is, and our epistemological stances, how we think we can learn about the world given that that is how we think it is. Those conclusions go back to theory, and that represents our increased understanding of the world around us. To retain progress, we need heterogeneity in methods, in theory, and in philosophy of science. We need to have different ontological stances, different epistemological stances, etc. So that means constructs are not natural kinds. That means that no definitions are really true, because they are not like the boiling point of water. And we want to retain diversity. So the solution here can't include centralization. We can't have one big database that the APA, for example, manages, where they say this is how everybody has to study depression or attitude from now on. And we can't have curation by a small group of people who make similar decisions. So one of the solutions, as you probably know, is to combine, well, you don't already know, you just know because I told you already earlier, to combine a definition with instructions for developing measurement instruments for the construct given that definition, for classifying existing measurement instruments as measurement instruments that measure that construct, again given that definition, and for eliciting and coding qualitative data as informative about the construct. And the idea is that these have to be accurate and detailed, consistent with each other, and that we kind of have to accept that for the foreseeable future they'll probably be kind of wrong, because we're kind of just starting out. The idea is that you can give these unique identifiers, which kind of work like DOIs. So there's this repository, Psycho1, and you can add this unique identifier, and then it loads a page with the information about the construct, and you can also browse the different construct definitions that are there. There are some methods to develop these. The simplest one is to just say what you do, because in any research project, you do have an extensive definition about the construct. You should have, at least, if you take yourself seriously as a researcher. You might as well just write it up and publish it. It's kind of scary, but you can do it. You could also just take it from a theory, combine multiple theories, do a scoping review to see how people define stuff, analyze one or more questionnaires and base your definition on this. You can get a team of experts together and then create a definition. You can formalize that using a Delphi approach. You can do qualitative research, or you can do quantitative research. So there are loads of, and this is of course just a list that Rick and me came up with when we wrote the article, but there are loads of ways to do this. One of the factors we're running into is that people are quite insecure. You're quite vulnerable if you suddenly make this extensive definition public, because as Jennifer just said, you feel like an expert, and then if suddenly you ask, yes, but what is empathy exactly? And why is it like that? Why do you draw the border there in human psyche and not there? Of course, we find that we don't really have answers because we were often not really trained in that. So this is something to work through. But I mean, we are in a period where more and more there's attention for the fact that we should actually take our errors seriously, and that it's okay to make mistakes and therefore improve. Okay, so there are two repositories that we'll use in this project. One is the Psycho1 one. So the Psycho1 repository is basically just this place where you put these constructs, you get unique identifiers, and then if you go to that URL, you see the construct definition with these instructions to develop measurement instruments, to classify measurement instruments, or code them, however you want to call it, in systematic reviews, and for qualitative research. You can specify those in spreadsheets, and there's a Shiny app that takes these and then converts them into a so-called YAML file, which is actually the file that forms the database. So this is quite easy to do from a technological point of view. After all, you only have to specify some fields, like the definition, the title, stuff like that. And then we have another repository for questionnaires. Actually, there's a third one for items, with only single item measures, but we won't use that here. For now, we'll just use the questionnaire one. You see an overview of the questionnaires here. There are only 3 in there right now, because this is really very fancy and new. And again, you have a questionnaire view with a unique identifier for a questionnaire, and that shows the items. And as you can see at the bottom here, the items also have unique identifiers. And that will enable accumulating research about validity of specific items in specific languages, etc. So that we can, well, machine readably encode the item that you're studying to automatically accumulate data. These as well are specified in a spreadsheet. This spreadsheet has multiple worksheets. So this is the one for metadata, but you also have one for the items, where you can see the item identifiers in column C. And some other ones at the bottom here. And then there's this Shiny app, LoveFox, where you can, if you specify an identifier for a questionnaire, you get a Lime Survey group that you can import into Lime Survey. And Lime Survey is like an open source ethical alternative to Qualtrics, for example, which we happen to use at the Open University. So one of the ideas is that we have this repository filled with all these measures for students and researchers. It's super easy to just get the questionnaire in a machine readable format. Of course, it's also quite easy to develop these applications for other software like Qualtrics if you happen to prefer closed science software. So you can type in the construct identifier like this, and then you import stuff, and then you download the LSD file and you save it. And then in Lime Survey you can import the group, and then you can select the file again, and then you can click import, and then for some reason it has an interesting color scheme to confirm that everything worked successfully. And then as you see here, you have basically all the items as we originally specified them in the spreadsheet, and then we exported them to an open format, and then the Shiny app converts that into a Lime Survey group that can be imported here. So this is one of the bijvangsten, one of the additional captures that we will capture in the project. So the entities to extract. Oh yeah, I added the stuff about literature reviews to give a brief overview. As you notice, I'm speaking quite slowly, but I think we will manage anyway in the time we have left. So there are a number of types of literature reviews. In the old days, before we were born, people did narrative reviews, where you basically just read stuff and then say what you think. Of course, at some point people started realizing that this can be quite biased, so you can't really get away with those anymore often. So now people do systematic reviews, where the process is as systematic as possible, so that bias becomes visible transparently and you can mitigate it more easily. A meta-analysis is two things, confusingly. It's the name for a set of statistical approaches to aggregate estimates, usually effect sizes, but they can also be prevalences, for example, or means. But it's also used as the term for systematic reviews that use meta-analysis to aggregate the results they extract from articles. And then you have scoping reviews, which they kind of started out to map the literature, so that you can very quickly get an idea of what kind of literature exists, so that you know whether it's worthwhile to do a more thorough systematic review, such as meta-analysis. But if you use them more from a meta-scientific perspective, it's basically a way to look at how researchers study stuff. So you still don't extract effect sizes usually, but you look at, for example, to give a wild example, the kind of definitions they use or the kind of measurement instruments they use. So that's one of the types that we will be studying. So systematic reviews have four stages. First you search, then out of everything you find you screen. We will actually skip the screening here, but normally you screen to find the relevant hits. Then you extract, and then at the end you synthesize to answer the research question or questions you had. Like any other project in life, that means that your preparation goes the other way around. So you start thinking about your synthesis, what kind of analysis you want to do. Then from this it follows what you need to extract from the sources. Then you think about what that means for how you should screen, and then you can develop your search strategy. I make this explicit because quite often people do this the wrong way around. They actually plan it as they go along, starting with the search strategy and not even thinking about the entities yet in advance. The extraction is the hardest bit about a systematic review, because there you have to slice the world up in tiny little pieces. So, for example, you have to decide whether to extract target population characteristics, and if so, which ones, study design characteristics, constructs, and then in the target population characteristics, whether you want age, whether you want sex, whether you want gender. And study design, the time between measurements, for example, whether you want to get included covariates. And when you have the studied constructs, whether you want to take the author's word for it, or whether you recode it into your own definitions to make sure that everything you extract is consistent with how you define constructs, which of course is not the same as the terms that the authors use, because of the mess in definitions and measurement instruments we saw earlier. But sometimes, if you want to recode, the definitions in the literature might be super short, say 15 or 16 words, so they might not actually be sufficient for coding. So then, do you first want to develop a set of definitions anyway to assist your coding efforts, or do you code in the authors or extract in the author's own words anyway? But the same is true for all the other categories, like gender, because definitions of genders can also differ per country. So take, for example, India, where they have the third gender as a thing, which we don't have in the Netherlands, for example. So there the same thing is true. If you think that anything is relevant enough to extract, that means it is important. So you have to have a clear idea of what it is if you want to classify stuff and extract stuff. So the entity bits is the most complicated bit. Fortunately, we kind of resolved that bit already, and there are only very few, so we can move quite fast there. We used Meta before, an R package that allows us to easily accumulate different extractions from different articles into the same database, and then also easily allows you to add other stuff on later. And it also has an interface with the ROC package for qualitative data analysis, so that we can actually easily code stuff later and then import the results back into the database. So this is how our extraction specification sheet looks, because in Meta before, you specify the stuff you extract in a spreadsheet first, and then it's imported into R and converted into an extraction script, which is basically an R Markdown file where the people do the extraction. Once you did the extraction, it also validates, so that if something goes wrong, at least you find out immediately, which of course saves a lot of time compared to later, because then you have to dive back into the PDF and find where you actually were and stuff like that. So you ideally do this when you have everything front and center in your mind. So the idea is you specify a spreadsheet, that gets converted into an R extraction script template, an RxS template, and that's validated. And then of course you do this for a lot of articles, and then you import them into R, and then you can, for example, do a meta-analysis with metaphor or other kinds of analysis. And then afterwards, if you want to extend it, you can quite easily extract a few other entities and then add them on, and then you just get a bigger database. So one of the goals here is to make a start on a huge database of empathy literature, to basically make the empathy literature machine readable in a way that's scalable and extendable over the years. So this is kind of how it looks if you extract, if you use RStudio, and if you have a very cool theme in RStudio. So the first thing you specify is the source identifier. That's the short DOI. That's all explained in the extractions we'll send soon. Then your extractor identifier. We created something for that called a shortkit, which is basically a very short code based on your ORCID. We'll explain that as well soon. The advantage of that is that it's always unique to you, and you can use it in multiple projects and also always know that you are you. So if you're ever in search for yourself, you just have to look for your shortkit and you know who you are. Some people need to go backpacking through India for that, but with a shortkit you don't need. And then you specify the curate. That's a unique code that we specify ourselves that allows us to easily add the bibliographic information later, so that we can add the stuff about the authors and the abstract and the title and stuff like that. Well, the language, we do that in ISO 639.3, which is a standard for languages of 3 characters. It will usually be ENG for English, of course, but well, there are websites where you can find all the languages. And then the most important thing, one of the most important things, the empathy definition. I have an example from Mira's bachelor thesis project from resilience, because I have these screenshots ready. So this is an article about resilience, and here they define resilience, and at least they're honest about the quality of the definition, already saying it could be rather loosely considered to be. And then you extract it by basically just copy-pasting it like this into the extraction script. And then Meta before and the ROC can export it to a file like this. It has the stuff between the square brackets. Those are codes, basically. They machine readably encode, in this case, the entity in red, which was called definition primary, and the source identifier, so the short DOI of the source, in cyan. And then in yellow is the actual text, the data, so to speak, that's coded. And then here are 2 codes that are attached by this specific student. And then once the stuff is coded, it can be imported back into the database. Okay, then for specifying instruments, because the measurement, the definitions are one part. For specifying the instruments, we have TOCs and TOMs. TOCs are open questionnaire specifications, and TOMs are, depending on your preference, open manipulation specification, or open measure specifications, or open metadata specifications. And these are to cover everything that's not a questionnaire, because questionnaires, conveniently, are quite well structured, so it's quite easy to make them machine readable. Manipulations can go all over the place, just like some measures, like EEG, for example, is much harder to create a language to specify that in that's similar to questionnaires. So the solution for now is to just have something with just metadata, so that we know it exists, it has a unique identifier, and then this is just a problem for future us. So the questionnaire specifications, as you saw earlier, contain just some metadata, like the language, ideally information about the measurement theory. I mean, we're optimistic. Then information about the items, and then there are response templates, kind of, because usually in questionnaires they use the same responses, so it's much easier to specify the response options once and then add it for every item. This is quite simple, and I have a blog post already walking you through this, so this should be quite doable. Then for the TOMs, the metadata things, that's really just one spreadsheet, kind of like this. It just describes what it is, and it's mostly a means for attaching a unique identifier to something that's not a questionnaire, so that in the future, once we have a way to make those machine readable, we can do that. Okay, that was it. I will now stop the recording. Thank you at home for listening along, and then I will open the floor to questions.